Hello everyone, my name's Brian Smale. I'm the director of the Canadian Index of Wellbeing here at the University of Waterloo. And today I'd like to tell you a little bit about the index and how we're making efforts to bring about change in Canada. To begin, I'd like to describe a little bit about how the CIW began. More than a decade ago, the Atkinson Charitable Foundation asked the essential question: what would it take to create a tool that truly measured Canadian well-being? Over the next several years, a number of nationwide consultations were undertaken to ask experts and Canadians what they felt were the essential components of well-being. With the support of the Funders Alliance, the essential 8 domains that currently constitute the CIW were identified. Research teams from across the country in the late 2000s were identified to help write reports that describe the fundamental indicators that were indicative of well-being within those domains. We moved to the University of Waterloo, where it currently resides, and the Composite Index was developed and released this past October. This lengthy process was guided by the CIW vision in that all Canadians should have the highest well-being status, and to get there we want to be able to identify, develop, and publicize statistical measures that provide Canadians with clear, valid, and regular reporting on progress towards well-being. To realize its vision, the CIW's mission is to conduct and share research on quality of life, particularly research that is based on trends in well-being relative to such measures as GDP, which are more popularly used to set policy. We want to encourage decision makers to consider evidence on quality of life when developing policy, and we also want to encourage Canadians to take part in the conversation and advocate for change that conforms to their values. As such, the CIW mission is built on 2 pillars: research and knowledge mobilization. Throughout its history, and continuing today, the CIW is rooted in essential Canadian values: fairness, diversity, equity, inclusion, health, safety, economic security, democracy, and sustainability. These values are rooted and reflected in the 8 domains that comprise the CIW. Here is the basic structure of the CIW. It's comprised of 8 domains, each of which contributes to overall well-being equally. Each domain is comprised of 8 specific indicators that were identified by the research teams as the most valid, reliable, and sustainable indicators linking the domain directly to well-being. Collectively, these 64 indicators, compiled into each of their domains, are consolidated into the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, a composite index that serves as the CIW's flagship product. With the release of our first composite index last October, we were able to illustrate how Canadians' well-being has fared since 1994, especially relative to GDP. We've seen some modest increases, but nothing compared to GDP. This provided us with a powerful illustration on how our quality of life has not kept pace with GDP, even in more prosperous times. The release of this single measure garnered considerable attention and led to a national conversation about well-being. Along with the composite index, we're also able to describe how each of the domains has fared over the same time period. This approach, which is similar to a dashboard approach to the reporting on well-being, allows us to consider in which areas of life well-being has fared better or worse. In the illustration here, we can see that the domains such as living standards, community vitality, and education have fared better than the environment, time use, and leisure and culture, although none of the domains has performed as well as GDP. This dashboard approach builds on the National Composite Index and allows us to extend the discussion into particular areas of concern. Extending this even further, by digging down to the indicator level, we can see specific areas within domains that may be of greater or lesser concern. For example, within the leisure and culture domain seen here, we see that time spent in social leisure, hours volunteering for local culture and recreation organizations, and visitation to Canada's national parks and national historic sites have all declined in previous years. These are areas that might require greater attention and can stimulate discussion about the types of policies, programs, and activities that would move us closer and faster to achieving well-being within this particular domain and ultimately overall. The combination of approaches, a composite index and a dashboard approach, to examining trends in well-being in Canada provided us with a variety of ways to communicate our message. The composite index was a conversation starter and drew attention to the limitations of GDP. The changes in each domain, as well as in each indicator, were described in plain language and through the use of compelling graphics, some of which are shown above. These contributed to broadly based discussions as well as detailed considerations of the specific things that had changed in Canadians' lives. The release of the report, How Are Canadians Really Doing?, accompanied by infographics and a video, all of which were bolstered by a technical report on the research underlying the process, contributed to greater impact and understanding among all constituencies. The evidence of the impact of this strategy was reflected in the wide media attention and contacts we received following the release last October. For example, the composite index and summaries of the changes within each domain were featured in a national newspaper and website in Canada. The release last October has not been the only way in which the CIW is being used. In recent years, communities in Canada have embraced the CIW and are using our framework to bring about local change. For example, in Simcoe County, it's a region just north of the city of Toronto comprised of 16 smaller communities representing just under 500,000 people, a resilience collaborative was formed by local champions to bring together residents and stakeholders concerned with the well-being of their communities. The focus of their efforts coincided with and is organized around the release of each of the CIW's domain reports. With each release, the collaborative responded by discussing how the domain report informed their sense of well-being in the region and led them to develop their own report, pulling in local data equivalent to the national indicators in order to make specific recommendations for change. In another example bringing the national down to the local, the city of Guelph, which is just west of Toronto with a population of 134,000 people, has used the CIW framework as a foundation for its plan for well-being. As one part of a larger initiative to engage the residents of their community, the city is partnering with the CIW as we develop a resident survey on well-being that, importantly, is designed around the 8 domains of the CIW. In other words, it will not just ask how well residents are doing, but rather how well relative to specific aspects linked to the domains comprising the CIW. The results will be used to engage Guelph citizens as part of a broader process of city enhancement. We also are now beginning to see how local initiatives as those described are informing our national agenda. The CIW is discussing with the Community Foundations of Canada how it can bring its strengths in data and research to the strengths of the CFC in community engagement and mobilization. There are clear links to the Vital Signs program of the CFC, so having the CIW framework guiding and assisting community-level action could ultimately have implications for a national-level program for well-being that's built on grassroots initiatives. So, all of these efforts are leading us to our next steps. This coming October, we'll be releasing an updated CIW Composite Index, which will extend the trends through to the end of 2010, thereby allowing us to see the impact of the 2008 recession. We also intend to release a report that tracks the CIW Composite Index as well as its domains for each of the provinces of Canada. We hope this effort will result in a greater sharing of ideas, strategies, and policies among the provinces and lead to enhanced well-being through the adoption of best practices. In conjunction with the Community-Level Well-Being Survey, we're also exploring the potential for adapting the CIW to the local level through a disaggregation of existing data or through the identification of local level proxies. In addition, we're beginning to examine well-being at the subpopulation level, especially for groups most vulnerable to societal changes. Each of these efforts, of course, face the challenge of data availability and integrity. Thank you again for taking part in this brief overview of the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. For more information, such as copies of all our reports, please visit our website. Thanks again.